Mid-February 1943. The battlefield of Sidi lay broken beneath a ceiling of heat and dust. The desert wind moved like a breath through wreckage. Half-buried helmets, crushed canteens, and the twisted shapes of burned-out tanks that still radiated yesterday's fire. To the west, the jagged ridges of the eastern dorsal were blurred by smoke columns and the rising whine of German 80s. The battle for Tunisia was less a front than a collapse in slow motion, and for the men of the U.S. 1st Armored Division, this was their baptism by fire against an enemy that had been fighting for years. Across the shifting sand, a line of American tanks, M4A1 Shermans with their high-arched cast hulls and wide tracks, struggled to regroup under the hammer of Panzer Abteilung 501. The Germans had brought their newest weapons to North Africa, the Tiger Furs, a machine so heavy that its treads left pits deep enough to fill with shadow. The sky throbbed with artillery, and the ground shuddered under each impact as the Tigers advanced methodically, one after another, their turrets turning with a slow, inevitable grace. Near a wadi south of Fide Pass, a Sherman named War Daddy II tried to hold its position. Its commander, a 26-year-old Texan sergeant named Edward Harris, had already lost 2 crewmen to a lucky 88 hit the day before. His tank still carried the faded white star and the markings of Company G, 1st Armored Regiment. Inside, the air smelled of oil, cordite, and sweat. The engine roared like a living thing behind the bulkhead. They had no idea how close the Tigers were until their first round tore through a nearby half-track, turning it into a column of black fire. Radio traffic was chaos. Calls for air support, orders to fall back, broken fragments of panic and static. Harris looked through his periscope and saw the dust plume of something massive moving across the ridge. When the Tigers fired, you didn't see the shells. You felt them, a low thump that seemed to punch the air out of your lungs before the sound even reached you. War Daddy II fired back, 3 rounds in quick succession. But the 75mm AP shells bounced off the front plate of the Tiger like stones off a church door. When a second Tiger flanked them, Harris gave the order no American tank commander wanted to give: abandon vehicle. The crew scrambled out under machine gun fire, sliding down the sand, running for the wadi. They didn't look back. By nightfall, the German advance had swallowed the entire American position. When the dust settled, the Tiger crews found the Sherman still standing. Tracks intact, engine unhit, tools and ammunition in place. A ghost of industrial warfare left behind in perfect condition. One of the German commanders, Major Hans-Georg Löwe of the 501st, walked around the tank with his hands clasped behind his back. "Amerikanische Maschine," he said softly. "Billig, aber sie läuft." Cheap, but it runs. The decision was immediate. Löwe ordered the tank to be repaired, fueled, and driven east to Sfax. It was to be sent to Germany for evaluation. What no one expected was that the machine would make the journey on its own power. For 4.5 days, a German reconnaissance team drove War Daddy II across 350 kilometers of North African terrain. Through sandstorms, over rock fields, and across dry riverbeds that had shattered the suspensions of half their own vehicles. Every kilometer became a test they didn't intend to run. The Sherman's engine never overheated. Its transmission never jammed. Its tracks threw sand but did not throw pins. By the time they reached the port, the men had stopped laughing about American toys. They spoke of it the way pilots spoke of a plane that always brings you home, with a mixture of trust and unease. At Sfax, a Kriegsmarine officer supervised its loading onto a freighter bound for Marseille. A small wooden crate of technical notes accompanied it. Fuel consumption, RPM readings, oil temperatures. The German drivers signed their names to a report that read simply, "Vehicle operational without incident over 350 kilometers." No German tank in the African Corps had ever done that. By the time the ship sailed, the American war machine had already left Tunisia far behind. New Shermans were arriving daily in Algiers and Oran. For every tank lost, 5 more rolled off assembly lines in Detroit, Toledo, and Lima. But the Germans did not yet understand what that meant. They saw one tank, and in their minds, they saw a machine to be copied, analyzed, perhaps improved. What they were really seeing was an idea that could not be contained by blueprints. When the freighter reached Marseille in March and the tank was rolled onto German rails, it was given an inventory number, US Kampfpanzer Nr, 1 inch, and a destination, the Kummersdorf proving grounds south of Berlin. There, behind barbed wire and pine trees, engineers waited to see the enemy's handiwork. They did not know they were about to stare into a mirror that reflected the limits of their own genius. The journey of War Daddy 2 had begun in defeat, but its meaning was only starting to unfold. What arrived in Germany that spring was not just a captured tank. It was the first sign that industrial war belonged to those who could build faster than they could dream. Spring, 1943. The forests south of Berlin were coming alive again. Thin light filtering through pine needles, the scent of wet soil rising from thawed ground. Trains moved constantly now, east and west, carrying everything from field artillery to wounded men, from burned-out wrecks to strange prizes from distant fronts. Among them, on a flatbed car marked Sondergut, rolled a single tank, its armor dulled by African dust, its once white star buried beneath a hastily painted black cross. Stenciled letters on its hull read simply, US Kampfpanzer Nr. 1. When the train stopped at the Kummersdorf proving grounds, a quiet ripple of curiosity passed through the engineers waiting on the platform. They had seen captured T-34s, Matildas, even the odd M3 Grant. But this one was different. It was new, unscarred by years of war, a product of a country they barely understood. A young assistant named Kurt Heinemann scribbled in his notebook, American tank, 30 tons. Appearance, rounded cast hull, no rivets. Crew 5, smells of oil and burnt paint. The flat car's clamps were released with a clang, and a crane slowly lowered the Sherman onto German soil. The diesel cough of a recovery tractor filled the air as it towed the tank toward the test hall. A long concrete building with wide doors and glass skylights, the kind of place that smelled of machine oil, chalk dust, and method. The plaque above the entrance still bore the name Heereswaffenamt Versuchsstelle Kummersdorf, though most of the men now called it simply the graveyard of ideas. Inside, the floor gleamed under harsh electric light. Engineers in gray coveralls circled the tank like surgeons preparing for an autopsy. Clipboards clicked, pencils scratched, calipers bit into steel. They spoke in the flat tones of precision. Armor thickness, 63 millimeters consistent. Track pitch, 178 millimeters. Transmission access via removable plate. A photographer took pictures from every angle, his flashbulb casting brief white storms across the olive-drab skin. For all its bulk, the Sherman felt strangely approachable. Its rounded cast surfaces looked almost soft compared to the angular menace of a Panther or Tiger. Where German tanks were machined to near aerospace tolerances, every contour of this American machine spoke a different language. One of speed, standardization, and something dangerously pragmatic. Engineer Wilhelm Bader, a veteran of Krupp's design bureau, ran his hand along the front glacis and muttered, "This was poured in one piece." They cast the entire hull. His assistant frowned. "Impossible. You can't control shrinkage at that scale," Bader only shrugged. They just did. On the bench nearby, a senior metallurgist heated a sample cut from the side plate and peered at it through a microscope. The carbon dispersion was clean, almost elegant. No microfractures, no impurities. "Uniform to a degree I have never seen," he murmured. This steel was rolled by giants. In another corner, a young technician disassembled the Sherman's gearbox and stopped, blinking. "Synchronized transmission," he said. 3 speeds forward, 1 reverse, with synchros. Even our Panzers don't have that. The supervising officer, Oberstleutnant Rudolf Esser, recorded everything in his report. US M4A1, simplified design, remarkable reliability, no unnecessary precision. Components interchangeable, maintenance-friendly. Suggest extensive evaluation. It wasn't admiration. Not yet. It was disbelief that something so crude-looking could be so refined where it mattered. That afternoon, a group from the Maybach Works arrived to study the powertrain. They found an engine built by Continental, a radial aircraft derivative, 6 cylinders, 400 horsepower. The Germans, who worshipped engineering complexity, stared at it as if they were looking at a riddle. The carburetor layout was simple, the cooling baffling brilliant in its directness. No exotic alloys, no fragile fittings, just a machine that did exactly what it was supposed to do again and again. Es ist zu einfach, one of them whispered. It's too simple. That phrase would echo through the corridors of Kummersdorf for months. At night, under blackout curtains, the test hall took on the atmosphere of a cathedral. The tank sat under suspended lights like an idol of the new world, its open hatches exposing a heart of stamped steel and braided wire. The men moved around it silently, their footsteps clicking on concrete. Every nut, every bolt, every weld seemed to hum with a logic that none of them could quite grasp. They were used to machines that demanded obedience, engines that punished even slight miscalculation, transmissions that needed to be courted like temperamental art. This tank, by contrast, asked nothing. It simply worked. In the cafeteria the next morning, conversation turned from metallurgy to philosophy. "They don't build tanks," said one engineer between bites of dark bread. "They build tractors that happen to carry guns." Another nodded. "Maybe that's why they win wars." A few laughed, but it was nervous laughter. Outside, Allied bombers were already beginning to darken the western skies. By late April, the team had disassembled half the vehicle. They cataloged every component: gear ratios, fuel line diameters, tolerances, casting marks. Every bolt head bore a number, every part fit another without filing or fitting. The Americans, they realized, didn't rely on craftsmen. They relied on systems. When the chassis was stripped bare, Esser stood at the foot of the assembly jig and dictated his summary. Where we seek perfection, they seek performance. Where we calculate tolerances in microns, they build margins of forgiveness. This machine could be built by a farmer with the right tools. No one argued. Outside the test building, pine trees swayed in a faint breeze, their needles whispering against the wire fences. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled eastward, carrying tanks to a front that was devouring them faster than they could be built. Inside, War Daddy 2 was being reassembled for live trials. The men moved slower now, almost reverently. They were beginning to understand that what they had captured in Tunisia wasn't just a tank. It was the physical expression of an economy that could outbuild time itself. By May, the order came down from Berlin. Demonstration model to be prepared for comparative testing with Panther and Ferdinand units. Attendance required. Minister Speer Esser signed the paper, placed it on his desk, and stared at it for a long moment. He had worked his whole life to perfect machines that symbolized the peak of human craftsmanship. Now before him stood something that suggested the opposite, that greatness might not lie in precision, but in production. As the train of thought settled in his mind, he looked back through the workshop window at the olive-drab shape gleaming under the lights. Every bolt, every weld seemed to whisper the same quiet truth. Every line of this tank told a story, not of genius, but of system. And in that realization, the seeds of dread began to grow. Summer 1943 arrived heavy with humidity over Brandenburg. The air around Kummersdorf hung thick with the scent of pine and machine oil. Every morning began with the cough of engines and the echo of steel on concrete. War Daddy 2 stood ready again. Its armor freshly painted, its tracks greased, its turret aligned for tests that would last months. For the German engineers, the fascination had turned into something quieter. heavier. Obsession mixed with unease. The first trials were purely mechanical. They began with cold starts, measuring how quickly the continental radial would turn over after a night in the chill of a German forest. 2 cranks, sometimes 3, and the engine would catch, settling into that deep, steady hum that seemed to defy the engineer's expectations. No misfire, no oil leak, no spark plug fouling. The Americans had built an engine that didn't care where it woke up. The test driver, Feldwebel Karl Reinhardt, climbed into the commander's hatch wearing a leather cap and goggles. He had spent years testing every German tank from Panzer II to Tiger. "Feels like a tractor," he said, half joking, as he pressed the starter and shifted into gear. The tank rolled forward with a smoothness that startled him. The synchronized transmission engaged cleanly, without the grind and whine that haunted German gearboxes. He drove it around the first test loop, and when he returned 20 minutes later, his grin had faded. "It's fast," he said quietly. "Too fast for its weight." The technicians logged every detail. Oil pressure steady, coolant temperature normal, transmission temperature lower than expected. One by one, they checked components for signs of strain, and found none. Esser's pencil hovered above his clipboard. He wrote a single word beside the results: stable. That afternoon, they began the endurance runs. 30 kilometers of mixed terrain, mud, gravel, loose sand, and rough cobblestone, designed to expose weakness. The Sherman devoured it all. Where Panthers overheated after 30 minutes, where Tigers cracked final drives after an hour, War Daddy 2 ran for 4 hours straight without complaint. In the observation tower, engineer Wilhelm Bader leaned on the railing, watching the olive-green machine move across the range with the indifferent confidence of something that knew what it was. He turned to his colleague. "You hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" "Exactly," Bader said. "Nothing. No grinding, no protest. It just goes," the younger man frowned. "Maybe it's luck." Bader shook his head. Luck doesn't run 400 miles without failure. When they brought the tank back into the hangar that evening, the crew drained the oil, measured metal content, checked for shavings. There were none. The gearbox teeth showed even wear. The bearings, clean. Even the gaskets held pressure. One mechanic, an older man from the Maybach works, ran his hand along the housing and muttered, "We would never have passed a design like this. Too crude. But maybe we were the fools." The next day, they began the slope tests. The Panther D prototype was rolled out first. It climbed the concrete incline slowly, the engine groaning, until halfway up one tread slipped on its own oil and the tank stalled. A tractor towed it down while technicians pretended not to notice the steam rising from its engine bay. Then came War Daddy 2. Reinhardt shifted to second, advanced the throttle, and drove straight up the slope. The tank climbed like it didn't understand the concept of resistance. No slippage, no stalling. The engine note stayed steady, the treads gripping cleanly. At the top, he paused, turned the turret, and looked down at the silent Germans watching below. He didn't wave. He just brought it back down, turned it off, and climbed out. "If you gave this to our drivers," he said, "they'd never come back to the Panther." For a moment, no one spoke. By July, the trials had expanded. Fuel consumption, braking, turret traverse, gun recoil, radio interference, vibration patterns. The Germans measured everything that could be measured. They plotted graphs, recorded temperature curves, timed gear shifts to the 10th of a second. They dismantled and reassembled the engine 3 times, expecting it to fail, to show weakness somewhere. It never did. Meanwhile, in a neighboring shed, a Panther sat with its transmission casing split open, a pool of oil beneath it. Mechanics cursed as they tried to replace cracked gear teeth. The contrast was humiliating. At lunch one afternoon, an engineer pushed away his plate and said bitterly, "We are artists trying to outpaint a factory." Esser looked up from his notes. "No," he said quietly. We are watchmakers trying to outbuild a hammer." The laughter that followed was short-lived. Everyone knew what he meant. As the heat deepened through August, the tests became harsher. They ran the Sherman day and night, 12 hours on the track, 12 under inspection. Each morning, the engineers gathered to hear the same verdict: operational, no faults. But it wasn't just the machine that unsettled them now. It was what it implied. The reports from the front had begun to tell the same story. Shermans everywhere. Columns of them rolling through Sicily, hundreds landing in Italy, more crossing the Atlantic each week. For every Tiger the Reich could build, America built 50 Shermans, and every one of them, it seemed, ran like War Daddy 2. During one evening briefing, Esser spread a set of charts across the table. "Panther," he said, pointing to a red line dipping sharply after 40 hours of use. "Tiger," another line dipping faster. Then he tapped a third, steady, flat, unbroken. "Sherman." No one spoke. The silence in the room was heavier than any argument. Finally, Bader said, "If this data is correct, then all our numbers are wrong." "They are," Esser said, "because we measured the wrong thing." "What thing?" "Perfection." He closed the folder. From that day on, the tone of the tests changed. The engineers no longer looked at War Daddy 2 with curiosity or contempt. They looked at it with something like respect. They began using it to calibrate new methods, running comparative data against Panthers, applying American-style stress margins to their designs. Quietly, almost shamefully, they started borrowing from it. At night, when the generators died down and the lights dimmed, some of them lingered near the tank. One man, a draftsman from Henschel, left a note on his clipboard. "If they win, it will be because they built for soldiers, not engineers." By September, War Daddy 2 had become the most studied foreign tank in Germany. Every day added another page to the file. 47 by then, bound in gray cardboard, stamped Geheim. The final endurance test came on a gray morning under drizzle. They ran the tank for 10 straight hours across rough ground, firing its gun, climbing obstacles, plunging through water traps. When they brought it back, the mud steamed off its hull. Oil pressure, normal. Transmission, smooth. Engine, steady. Esser took off his cap, rubbed his forehead, and said to no one in particular, "It refuses to fail." Behind him, the sound of the Panther's stalled engine filled the air again. A choking cough followed by silence. In the workshop log, the final line of that day's report read, "Reliability not the result of chance, but of principle." What began as curiosity had become revelation. What the Germans had captured in Tunisia was not a miracle of design, but the embodiment of a truth they had never wanted to believe: that wars were no longer won by the best engineers, but by the best factories. And in the quiet that followed, the men of Kummersdorf began to realize that their own brilliance was being outpaced not by talent, but by time. June 1943. The morning sky over Hillersleben hung low and silver, a thin veil of cloud stretching across the artillery range like smoke that refused to rise. Rows of wooden bleachers had been erected along the edge of the proving ground, their rough planks already filling with the gray and black of Wehrmacht uniforms. A brass band tuned somewhere behind the control shed, its notes swallowed by the rumble of engines being warmed up. The air smelled of fuel, coffee, and tension. Albert Speer arrived shortly after 9, his staff car trailing a second vehicle loaded with stenographers and orderlies. He stepped out wearing the neat civilian gray coat that had become his armor against the chaos of the regime. Around him gathered senior officers from the Panzerwaffe, representatives from Krupp, MAN, and Henschel, and a few select foreign technology analysts from Kummersdorf, including Esser and Bader, who stood near the edge of the range, clipboards in hand, faces unreadable. They were not here for ceremony. They were here to witness proof. Proof that Germany's new generation of armored vehicles could dominate the desert, the steppe, and the factory floor alike. But no one expected the demonstration's quiet interloper. An American tank that had crossed an ocean and a continent to stand here in the heart of the Reich. The test sequence was simple. Obstacle course, grade climb, endurance lap, and fire control drill. The machines would perform in succession. The new Panther D prototype, the Ferdinand assault gun, and finally, the captured M4A1 Sherman marked U.S. Kampfpanzer Nr. One Speer stood with his hands behind his back as the first engine roared to life. The Panther lurched forward, its tracks throwing wet sand. It looked magnificent, the angular hull and high turret promising menace and mastery. But within minutes, the illusion began to falter. On the second incline, the gearbox protested, a shriek rising over the crowd. The driver hesitated, shifted again, and the transmission locked in neutral. Smoke curled from the exhaust. Mechanics ran forward waving rags, and the great cat rolled backward down the slope, defeated by its own perfection. A few officers applauded politely when it recovered enough to limp off the course. Speer's expression did not change. He made a note in the margin of his folder. Vibration at 35-degree incline. Investigate final drive. Then came the Ferdinand. It advanced like a fortress on tracks, its gun protruding like the barrel of a train cannon. The first 100 meters were smooth. The next 100, agonizing. Halfway up the same grade that had humbled the Panther, the Ferdinand's electric motors shuddered and died. Silence followed, broken only by the whisper of wind through the grass. The machine that weighed 70 tons could neither move nor fight. When the American tank's turn came, there was no announcement. Esser simply raised his hand to signal the driver. The radial engine caught with its familiar throaty rumble, a sound less mechanical than human, the steady breathing of confidence. The Sherman rolled forward, its olive hull streaked with mud, its white star faint beneath the black cross. The incline loomed ahead. No one expected much. They assumed the lighter tank would stall, that its aircraft-derived engine would falter under the grade. Instead, it climbed. Smoothly. Effortlessly. The exhaust note deepened but never strained. The tracks gripped cleanly. The machine moved as if gravity itself had stepped aside. At the crest, it paused. Reinhardt, the test driver, turned the turret with one deliberate sweep, then descended in a perfect controlled crawl. No one clapped. The silence that followed was colder than scorn. Only the sound of the engine idling broke it. Speer removed his cap, wiped dust from his sleeve, and said quietly, "Run it again." They did, this time with the Panther and Sherman side by side. The difference was obscene. The German tank growled and lurched. The American purred. Dust rose behind them in twin plumes, one broken, one continuous. When both machines stopped at the finish line, the Sherman's engine temperature read 180 degrees Fahrenheit. The Panther's nearly 260. A technical officer muttered, "Their crude beast is laughing at us." Esser's pencil trembled against his clipboard. He wrote, "Demonstration to Minister. Sherman's behavior exemplary. Represents triumph of process over precision." During the lunch interval, Speer stood beneath the shade of a camouflage net, sipping coffee from a tin mug. The officers around him spoke in cautious fragments about spare parts, machining tolerances, logistics. No one mentioned the word mass production, though it hung over them like an unspoken curse. When one general dared to suggest that the Americans built quantity because they could not build quality, Speer turned his head slightly. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps they build quantity because they understand quality differently." Later, a correspondent from Das Reich arrived to document the event. His article, published 2 weeks later, would praise the scientific curiosity of our technicians studying foreign models and mention North American laboratories with a tone of polite condescension. Between the lines, however, every reader could sense the anxiety. If the enemy's average tank could outperform the Reich's masterpiece under its own designer's eyes, what did that say about the war itself? By afternoon, the demonstration had turned somber. The Ferdinand was towed away. The Panther sat with its hatches open, mechanics sweating inside. Only War Daddy 2 remained mobile. For the final sequence, they asked it to tow a disabled Panther up the test hill, a gesture half in jest, half in defiance. The Sherman's engine note deepened, its treads biting into the slope. Slowly, almost mockingly, it pulled the Panther to the top. When it stopped, the cable went slack. Someone laughed, one sharp, nervous bark that turned into silence as quickly as it began. Speer turned to Esser. "What does your data say?" "That it should not be possible, Herr Minister." "But it is." Speer looked back at the tank, its engine still ticking softly in the heat. For a man obsessed with rational order, the moment felt like betrayal. Proof that efficiency could be more powerful than brilliance, that mass production could achieve what genius could not. He said nothing more, only returned to his car and drove away. Behind him, the officers remained staring at the machine from Tunisia, the tank that had come from a world where factories replaced heroes. That night, as the sun died over the pines, the engineers at Hillersleben logged their final note of the day. Demonstration successful. Audience reaction subdued. In the months that followed, the Reich would announce new weapons, longer guns, thicker armor, faster engines, but none of them could erase the memory of that morning when a cheap American tank climbed a German hill and exposed a truth no one dared speak aloud. War Daddy 2 had not just conquered terrain, it had conquered pride. The weeks after Hillersleben were not marked by fanfare but by paperwork, endless stacks of it. Reports bound in gray folders moved from Kummersdorf to Berlin, from Speer's ministry to the offices of the Heereswaffenamt. Each bore the same understated heading: US Kampfpanzer Nr. 1. Ergebnisse der Vergleichsversuche, results of comparative trials. But behind those sterile words hid something close to panic. In July 1943, as the battle at Kursk consumed the Reich's last strategic reserves, German engineers sat in airless offices, drafting memos about a tank from across the ocean. They wrote cautiously, knowing every sentence could be read as treasonous truth. Subject demonstrates consistent performance over 400 kilometers without mechanical failure, one report read. Gearbox shows no signs of pitting or misalignment. Maintenance requires minimal specialized tools. Another added, if produced domestically, this system could reduce assembly time per vehicle by 60%. None dared add the conclusion that hung in every mind. We cannot match this. At Kummersdorf, Esser and his team continued their quiet studies. The tank was disassembled yet again, each component catalogued with growing reverence. They weighed pistons, measured crankshafts, and mapped lubrication flow patterns. The numbers kept defying logic. The oil pump, simple, almost primitive, delivered pressure curves smoother than any Maybach design. The cast hull, rejected by German foundries as imprecise, absorbed shock better than their hand-welded armor plates. Every discovery was another small humiliation. In early August, a delegation from Henschel arrived to cross-check data for the Tiger II program. They examined the Sherman's final drive and scribbled furiously. Stamped steel housings, no precision grinding, one muttered. How do they prevent heat warping? Bader answered without looking up. They don't. They build tolerances wide enough that it doesn't matter. The room fell silent. Meanwhile, the front lines bled. Panthers broke down by the hundreds on their way to Kursk. Transmissions seized, engine fires raged, final drives shattered. Panzer brigades arrived with 30 tanks and reached the battlefield with 10. The field reports mirrored Kummersdorf's findings, only written in the language of despair. Vehicle unserviceable. No spares available. Request evacuation. By autumn, the comparative charts looked like autopsy reports. The Sherman's reliability line ran flat across the page like a heartbeat that refused to falter. The Panthers plunged and flickered. The Tigers vanished entirely after a few dozen hours. Below, in careful script, an analyst had written, "Operational readiness. Sherman 83%, Panther 37%, Tiger 28%. That was the number Speer underlined twice in red pencil when he saw it. Inside the Ministry of Armaments, arguments broke out between engineers and ideologues. Speer, ever the pragmatist, proposed simplifying production, cutting part variations, reducing inspection tolerances, adopting modular designs. But each suggestion collided with the same wall of pride. The German industrial system was not built to accept imperfection. Its very identity depended on craftsmanship, not assembly. By late 1943, Allied bombs began falling over Ruhr and Kassel, where the heart of that craftsmanship beat. Factories that had built tanks by hand now built them under fire. Workers were replaced by forced labor, machines by improvisation. Quality collapsed, precision warped. At Nibelungenwerke, Panther hulls arrived misaligned. At Maybach, engines left the line with untested bearings. The Reich's obsession with perfection had turned into its own sabotage. At Kummersdorf, the engineers knew it before anyone else. They saw it in the metal. The new Panthers sent for testing bore welds like scars, their steel grain coarse and brittle. "Look at this," Bader said one evening, tapping the edge of a cracked armor plate. "We are building art with mud." Esser nodded. "And they," he said, gesturing toward War Daddy 2, "build hammers with music." The contrast became unbearable. In November, word arrived that captured Shermans were being pressed into German service in Italy and the Balkans, painted gray, rearmed, renamed PES KPFW, M4748A. The reports from those units were the cruelest of all. Engines reliable. Mobility superior. Crews satisfied German tankers trusted the enemy's machines more than their own. The realization struck like moral defeat. What good was genius if it broke before it reached the field? By the winter of 1944, bombing raids turned the Maybach works to rubble. Panther gearboxes were produced in barns and basements. In Berlin, requisition forms stacked higher than hope. Esser kept his data locked in a cabinet marked Verschlussache, restricted. But he knew the war had already moved beyond mathematics. His last report, dated February 12, 1944, contained only one line of conclusion. Enemy industrial capacity renders mechanical comparison irrelevant. Outside his office, snow drifted through shattered windows. Inside, the olive-drab hull of War Daddy 2 sat quietly beneath a tarp, its steel cold but unyielding. It had survived the desert, the trials, and the pride of an empire that had built itself on the illusion of superiority. In March, when Esser heard that Allied forces were landing in Anzio, he opened the file again, reread his earliest notes. Simplicity, ruggedness, efficiency. And smiled bitterly. "They understood war," he murmured. "We understood machines." As spring approached, the once proud proving ground of Kummersdorf began to resemble a graveyard of projects. Prototypes lined up like fossils of ambition. Panthers, Tigers, unfinished E-Series hulls. Each represented a dream that cost too much time and demanded too much perfection. And among them, still running when asked, still obedient in every test, stood War Daddy 2. No one saluted it. No one photographed it again. Yet every man who had worked on it carried the memory of its quiet defiance, a machine that had no arrogance, only purpose. By the time the Allied bombers reached Berlin, most of Kummersdorf's engineers had already accepted the truth they could never say aloud, that the war was not being lost on the battlefield, but in the factory. Their finest machines had broken themselves. Theirs had not. April 1945. The pine forests south of Berlin burned at their edges, their trunks scorched black by shell bursts from the approaching Soviet lines. The Kummersdorf proving grounds, once the sanctum of German engineering, had become a military ghost town. Test stands lay overturned, files scattered like leaves, and the skeletal frames of unfinished machines rusted under drifting smoke. Somewhere inside the main hall, under a half-collapsed roof, the captured Sherman sat beneath a tarp, its green paint dulled to the color of dust. The stenciled cross on its hull had peeled away, revealing faint traces of the American star beneath. By then, no one spoke of War Daddy 2 by name. It was simply the American tank, forgotten among greater failures. Yet even in those final weeks, when engineers burned documents to keep them from Soviet hands, a few paused before its still intact frame. One of them, Wilhelm Bader, folded a single page from his notebook, the summary sheet from the 1943 trials, and tucked it beneath the driver's seat before walking away. "Let them find the truth for themselves," he whispered. Outside, artillery thundered from the direction of Jüterbog. Trucks loaded with crates of research files rumbled north, guarded by exhausted soldiers who no longer believed in victory. Esser oversaw the evacuation until the last moment. When the final train left, he stayed behind, locking the gates to a facility that no longer existed on any map. That night, he wrote his last report by candlelight. Subject vehicle remains operational. Condition excellent. Recommendation: preserve for future study. Lessons beyond politics. He did not know whether anyone would ever read it. 2 weeks later, Soviet armor rolled through the shattered gates. Soldiers of the 2nd Guards Tank Army found the hall littered with wrecks. A Panther with its turret blown open, a Tiger missing its engine, and in the corner, a foreign silhouette that looked almost alive. They examined the Sherman briefly, noted its English markings, and chalked a red star on its side before towing it to a depot outside Luckenwald. Somewhere in the confusion of the next few months, it vanished. Perhaps scrapped, perhaps sent east as a curiosity. No one ever saw War Daddy 2 again, but its ghost lingered. When American technical teams entered Kummersdorf that summer, they found fragments of Esser's reports scattered among the ruins. The files astonished them, not because of what the Germans had learned, but because of how much they had understood. One engineer wrote home to Detroit. "They measured everything we built and finally realized it wasn't design that beat them. It was repetition. The captured data was boxed, translated, and shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground. There, in 1946, a young ordnance officer studying post-war tank doctrine underlined a single phrase from the German report: simplicity equals endurance. That phrase would outlive everyone who had written it. By the 1950s, when West Germany began to rebuild its defense industry under NATO supervision, a new generation of engineers pored over those same wartime archives. Among them was a former apprentice from Kummersdorf who had once taken oil temperature readings on War Daddy 2. Now working for Porsche in Stuttgart, he carried the memory of that American tank like a compass. When the design team for the Bundeswehr's new main battle tank convened in the early 1960s, he said something that silenced the room. "We must build like the Americans. Simple, strong, easy to repair in the field. No miracles, only machines." The men listened. And when the prototype that would become the Leopard 1 rolled out in 1965, its philosophy was unmistakable. Clean lines, modular systems, reliability before ornament. It was not born of German pride, but of German humility learned the hard way. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the descendants of War Daddy 2, the Pershings, the Pattons, carried the same industrial DNA. Their strength was not mystical, not the product of genius, but of a system that believed in quantity as a moral principle. In American factories, workers still assembled tanks the same way. Torque a wrench, checklist, next in line. each one another repetition of the same quiet miracle the Germans had failed to comprehend. Esser survived the war, living out his years under a false name near Bremen. He never spoke publicly about Kummersdorf, but in the 1950s he corresponded with a British historian who asked about the Sherman. His reply was brief. "We did not lose to a better tank. We lost to a better idea." The letter ended with a single sentence in English, underlined twice. The machine was honest. Decades later, in a museum in Munster, visitors would stop before a restored M4A1 Sherman bearing the number 3067641. Its serial matched the records of War Daddy 2. No one could confirm if it was truly the same tank, but the plaque beneath it read, "Captured in Tunisia, 1943. Tested at Kummersdorf." Its reliability astonished the enemy. Children climbed onto its glacis plate, tourists snapped photographs, and the curators let the ambiguity remain. It was fitting, after all, that a machine built for utility should end its life as a legend. For the men who once studied it, the lessons had never faded. They had learned that perfection was fragile, that pride could break under dust and distance, that the hum of a steady engine could be more powerful than any speech about destiny. The war had stripped away every illusion except one. That survival favors the simple. In the end, War Daddy 2 had fought no battles on German soil, yet it had changed the course of every one that followed. From the assembly lines of Detroit to the design rooms of post-war Europe, it whispered the same truth. Strength is not in brilliance, but in endurance. Victory is not in invention, but in repetition. And sometimes, the quietest machine leaves the loudest echo. The camera pans across the tank one last time, sunlight glinting off the worn metal. Somewhere deep inside, an old bolt catches the light, still firm, still holding. It wasn't built to last, but it outlived the empire that tried to understand it.